All right, ladies and gentlemen. So this is going to be a video to kind of help you guys do and work through your respiratory notes that we're going to be doing on Classroom. Very similar to the heart, how you had like day one, which was chambers and valves, and there's a video to go with it, and you filled out some slides. And then day two, you did the same thing, but for some blood vessels, we're going to do basically the same thing for respiratory. But respiratory, we're going to just do one day of. There's no need to break it up because respiratory is actually one of the easiest systems. It's super, super important, right? Because it's how we get oxygen. But in terms of complexity, it's actually really simple. It's just a bunch of tubes that have air going through them. They start off really big and then they get narrower and narrower and narrower. You exchange oxygen and then you use the exact same tubes to send carbon dioxide back up. So it's actually a really simple process. And you probably actually already know like almost all of the vocab associated with this. You just might not know exactly what they look like. So we're going to use this video to kind of follow through that PowerPoint that'll be in Classroom, and you guys are going to be filling out those slides. So we're going to briefly kind of talk about how air gets down to your lungs, how it's going to come back out. And then next class, after you complete this, you're going to start to focus on what exactly happens in the lungs themselves. Right now, we're just talking about how the air basically gets to your lungs and back. And so next class, I'll be zooming in and focusing more specifically on the lungs. So when you breathe in, right there, when you inhale, as we call it, there'll be two different places you can take air in through. We have number one, which is your nasal cavity. And then you have number two, which is your mouth or your oral cavity. It's important to note that you want to make sure you actually call it your oral cavity and your nasal cavity. You don't want to call it your nose and your mouth because the mouth and the nose are just the actual openings, right? So right here and right here, the cavity is the stuff that extends beyond it into this area, okay? So make sure you know them as the oral cavity and the nasal cavity. It's going to be like, that's the scientific term we want to use. So they're going to go, that's where air is obviously going to come in. And you'll notice that eventually they meet right here. Okay, number 7 is basically where they meet, and it's called the pharynx. So that's where the nasal cavity and your oral cavity come together and meet. This is why you can breathe while you're chewing food, right? Or you can drink a cup of water and breathe at the same time, because you can have air coming in one tube while your mouth is taking in some sort of food or liquid, right? You can't necessarily breathe back out, but the idea is that you can still take in some oxygen at the same time. Your pharynx, which is number 7, is going to be where, like when you have like sore throats and things of that nature, like strep, would be bacteria that are growing in that area. Number 3 is usually more often called in slang terms your voice box, right? But we want to use scientific terms here. So it's what we call your larynx. The reason it's called your voice box is because if you were to actually look at it, it's almost like a cartilage box type shape. And what it does is, due to its shape, your body has little tiny muscles in it that can alter how sound moves through it. So that's why when people are singing and talking, right, you can change your voice a little bit. You can make your voice a higher pitch or make your voice a lower pitch, right? And doing that is altering the shape of and all the little corridors in that box using your muscles. Once you've moved through your larynx, we're then going to get to this tube here, number 8, which is called your trachea. Now the trachea, you'll notice, has these like little rings on it. They're black rings, and I'm kind of coloring over them in blue. Those are cartilaginous rings. They're basically rings made of cartilage. If you think about it, it's kind of like if you were to go to like a fast food place, right? And you get those straws, the little rings on the straws that keep it open and keep you from like pinching it shut. That's what those rings on your trachea do. So they let your throat stay open, right? Because we don't ever want our trachea to be closed. We want to be constantly exchanging oxygen and carbon dioxide all the time. So our throat, specifically our trachea, has to stay open 24/7. It can't close, right? What we'll talk about in our next and last unit for the year is digestive. In digestive, you have a different tube called your esophagus. That tube can actually seal shut, and that's okay because it's only used for food and water. That's not a big deal. But for your trachea, we need it to stay open. So you actually have 2 tubes in your throat. You have the trachea, which is used purely for air, and you have the esophagus, which is used for liquids and foods. If you guys have ever been eating something or drinking something, right, and there's the saying, right, it goes down the wrong tube and you start coughing and all this stuff, right? What has happened is that food has accidentally, rather than going down the esophagus like it's supposed to, it went down your trachea. It's technically not in the diagram, but it is on your slide, so I want to mention it now. There's a little structure called the epiglottis. What the epiglottis does is it basically is like a flap. It covers your trachea so food doesn't go down it. So whenever you swallow, that esophagus, or I'm sorry, that epiglottis covers your trachea so that food and water doesn't get down it, right? That way it goes down your esophagus and only air goes down your trachea. But every once in a while, that epiglottis doesn't fully cover it, right? Especially like if you accidentally swallowed before you're supposed to, which sounds weird, but as I say that, you guys know exactly what I'm talking about, right? Like you swallowed earlier than you expected to. Like let's say someone jumped out and scared you and a little bit of water went down your throat as you were drinking, right? What is happening is because that epiglottis didn't close over your trachea, some of that water went down there. It's not supposed to. So your body's coughing to kick up that water or that food or whatever it is to get it out of that airway, because your trachea and your lungs, again, is only designed for air, not water. So if you get water or food down there, that's when you start coughing to get it up out of your trachea so it goes back down your esophagus, which is used for food. So that's the tube that goes down. And you'll notice, I'm just going to zoom in a little bit, you'll notice that at number 5 and at number 9 here, so here and here, your trachea kind of splits. It goes in two different directions. 5 and 9 are both called your bronchi or bronchi. So you have a left one and a right one, and they are what are going to branch into each lung. And I'm realizing that's not the super clear writing. So bronchi, just so you guys know, let me make a little bit of a finer pencil point tip here. Bronchi, it's an O, because I know you guys are going to have trouble seeing my handwriting. That's an O. So I'll rewrite that one for you here as well. So your trachea branches into two bronchi. Now, the word bronchi and their smaller version, which is number 10, your bronchioles, that term might sound familiar. If you've ever heard of someone having bronchitis, bronchitis is the inflammation or swelling of these tubes. So basically, like I said at the very beginning when we started, your respiratory system is actually really straightforward. It's a bunch of tubes that get smaller and smaller and smaller, right? So we started with our air coming in our nose and mouth, going past our pharynx, going past our larynx, going into our trachea. Then the trachea is going to split and get a little bit more narrow and become your bronchi. Then those are going to split and become narrow. So you can see they split off into all these different branches here, right? Those are all of your bronchi, or I'm sorry, your bronchioles, okay? The idea is that it keeps getting smaller and smaller. When you have bronchitis, basically what's happening is these bronchioles are swollen, usually because you're sick, you might have a virus or a bacteria, but basically they're swollen, and when they're swollen, less air can get through them. It's also the same if you are, if you have asthma. If you have asthma, what's happening is your bronchioles become swollen or inflamed, so that way they can't move as much air, which is why if you've ever had an asthma attack, you feel that like shortness of breath. That's because they're not getting as much air through them as they need to. So when you take your inhaler, what you're doing is you're basically inhaling a medicine that helps to open up those bronchioles so that more air can get through them. Okay. Number 4 is going to be our lungs, obviously. So after our bronchioles split into our there are all these little tiny fibers in our lungs that are our bronchioles, all these little tiny tubes. At the end of these tubes, you'll see in number 11, it's supposed to be like a zoomed in picture. And we're going to talk way more about bronchioles and number 11 next class. But number 11 are what we call our alveoli, kind of like the word ravioli. Alveoli are these tiny little sacs that almost look like bunches of grapes. They are where we actually exchange oxygen. So this right here, those little microscopic structures have tons of blood vessels, and that's where your blood is going to drop off carbon dioxide and you're going to exhale it, and that's where it's going to pick up oxygen. Okay, so the alveoli are the actual place where we exchange oxygen in our body. Okay, so if you're a smoker or anything like that, what ends up happening is all that tar and all that bad stuff in cigarettes and all those sorts of things, what they do is they clog your alveoli so you can't exchange nearly as much oxygen as you should. Okay. And then lastly, number 6, it's probably the only bad part about this diagram, is your diaphragm. Okay. Your diaphragm is this really thin muscle along the bottom here that helps you inhale and exhale. When it goes up and down, it actually causes your lungs to open and close. It's really, we would, if we were in school, we would spend way more time on it, but we're not going to because we're not in school. But your lungs are not a muscle. They're not an empty bag. Everyone thinks they're a muscle or they're some sort of bag that opens and closes. They're not. If you were to cut open a lung, like last year we had Mr. Hallish cut a deer, so we brought in a deer lung. When you cut open a lung, it's actually almost like a sponge, right? It's solid all the way through, but it's got lots of little air pockets, okay? It's not an empty bag, and it cannot contract and expand on its own. It's not a muscle. It has no muscle tissue. The way your lungs inflate and deflate is when your diaphragm goes up and down. Think about when you take a big breath in, right? Your chest expands. When your chest expands, that's when your lungs kind of get bigger and take in oxygen because your diaphragm has gone down. When it goes down, it creates almost like this vacuum. We would talk about it more if we were in school. And if you take physics, you might know about the gas laws. When the diaphragm goes down, there's volume, there's more volume. So the air goes into your lungs. And when your diaphragm goes up, that's when you exhale because you're reducing your volume. So air is getting pushed out. Okay. But anyways, the real important thing is that you know that the diaphragm is what controls your breathing. So this little thin flap of muscle at the bottom of your chest controls your entire breathing cycle. Nothing else in here controls how fast or slow you breathe or anything like that. Your lungs can't control your breathing rate. All they are big sponges that exchange oxygen and carbon dioxide. Okay. So those are all the different parts of your respiratory system. So again, just as a quick review, we're going to come in, you can either breathe in your nasal or your oral cavity. It's going to go past your pharynx, which is where those two cavities come together, past your larynx, which is your voice box, and into your trachea, which is this straw-like tube in your throat. That's going to go down all the way to your chest cavity and branch off into your bronchi. Your bronchi are going to branch off into smaller tubes, which are called bronchioles. And at the very end of these bronchioles are microscopic little sacs with blood vessels on them called alveoli. And that's where we actually exchange our oxygen and carbon dioxide. And this whole breathing cycle is controlled by the diaphragm moving up and down. Okay, so you guys should be using this video to help you go through the PowerPoint. In the PowerPoint, what you're going to be responsible for is one, giving me a definition for what each thing does. I just went over all of them, so if you want to pause the video after I go over each term, you can, that's fine. It's up to you, or you can Google things. Just as always, make sure when we Google, and I noticed this on a lot of your guys' heart PowerPoints where you Googled, and that's fine, you can use the internet. Just make sure you put it in a definition that makes sense to you and definition that you can understand. So do that. And then the other thing is you're going to be using this diagram I just completed in front of you to help you figure out in the PowerPoint where each thing is, okay? So you're diagramming where everything is on each slide, and you are telling me the function of each organ. And then next class, you guys are going to be doing like it's not really a web quest. It's, remember those gizmos that we did? It's not a gizmo, but it's something similar where you're going to have a handout. It's going to kind of take you through this online activity, okay? As always, guys, feel free to send me an email, send me a remind text if you have any questions, comment on Classroom, anything like that. But otherwise, we will probably be talking next week in a Google Meet to kind of go over some things, okay? Have a good one, guys.